The fastest way to discover what someone truly values is to watch what they do the moment money changes their life. My name is Michael Turner, and after 40 years of marriage, I never imagined a single phone call could erase everything my wife and I had built together. That Tuesday morning began like hundreds of others before it. I drove my old pickup truck to the local home improvement store because the wooden railing on our back porch needed replacing before winter arrived. I had already measured the boards the night before and carried a folded list in my shirt pocket with every item I needed. Retirement had taught me to enjoy simple routines. I no longer rushed through life. I liked taking my time comparing lumber, talking with employees who had become familiar faces over the years, and stopping for a cup of coffee before heading home. Patricia usually laughed at my habit of spending half an hour choosing the perfect piece of wood, but she also admitted that nothing I built ever needed to be repaired twice. While I was loading pressure-treated boards into my truck, my cell phone rang. I smiled when I saw Patricia's name. Earlier that morning, she had driven downtown to meet with attorney Richard Collins regarding the estate of her late Aunt Eleanor. We knew her aunt had been comfortable financially, but neither of us expected anything extraordinary. I answered with my usual greeting, expecting to hear excitement or relief. Instead, her voice sounded completely different. It was calm, distant, and strangely formal. "Michael," she said without hesitation, "I need you to pack your things today." At first I thought I had misunderstood her because of the noise in the parking lot. "What did you say?" I asked. She took a slow breath. "The inheritance is much larger than anyone expected. Richard confirmed everything this morning. I am inheriting several $1,000,000, the house in Florida, and investment accounts. I have been thinking for a long time, and I do not want to spend the rest of my life the way we have been living. I want you out of the house before I get home this evening." For several seconds, I simply stared through the windshield at families walking across the parking lot carrying flowers, paint cans, and bags of garden soil. Life around me continued as though nothing had happened. I waited for her to laugh and admit this was some terrible joke. She never did. "Patricia," I said quietly, "we have been married for 40 years. "I know exactly how long we have been married," she replied. "That is why I am asking you to make this easy. I have already decided." There was no anger in her voice. Somehow that hurt more than if she had shouted. It sounded like someone reading instructions from a piece of paper. I asked whether we could at least talk face to face before making a decision that would change both of our lives. She answered with a sentence I will never forget. "There is nothing left to discuss. I finally have the freedom to live the life I deserve." Then the line went silent. I remained sitting in my truck for nearly 10 minutes with the phone still resting in my hand. During those quiet moments, I thought about our first apartment with secondhand furniture, the nights we worked extra jobs to save for our first home, the years spent raising our daughter Emily, and every sacrifice that had slowly built the comfortable life we shared. None of those memories disappeared because of one conversation, but they suddenly felt as though they belonged to someone else. I started the engine and drove home without anger, without speeding, and without rehearsing arguments. As I pulled into the driveway, I looked at the house we had built together over 4 decades. Then I smiled to myself for the first time since the phone call, because there was one important detail Patricia had completely forgotten, and by the time she came home that evening, she was going to discover it on her own. I carried only what belonged to me. 2 suitcases filled with clothes, a small toolbox my father had given me 40 years earlier, a box of family photographs that Patricia had never cared much about, and the old coffee mug Emily painted for me when she was 8 years old. I moved slowly through every room, not because I was reluctant to leave, but because I wanted to remember the life we had once shared before bitterness found its way into it. The living room still held the couch we bought after saving for nearly a year. The kitchen window overlooked the maple tree we planted the week Emily started kindergarten. Every corner of the house carried memories that could never be measured in dollars. Around 3 o'clock, my friend George Miller pulled into the driveway with his pickup truck. George had known me since high school and had helped me through enough difficult seasons to recognize when I needed company more than conversation. He stepped out, looked at the packed boxes near the front door, and quietly asked, "What happened?" I simply handed him my phone so he could read the short message Patricia had sent after our call. It contained only one sentence. "Please be gone before I get home." George slowly shook his head before giving the phone back. "You can stay in my guest house as long as you need," he said. "No questions asked." I smiled gratefully. I appreciate that more than you know. Together we loaded my belongings into his truck. Neither of us rushed. We treated every box with care because most of them held memories rather than possessions. Before leaving, I walked through the empty house one final time. I turned off every light, adjusted the thermostat, watered the flowers on the kitchen windowsill, and placed my wedding ring inside the top drawer of Patricia's bedside table. Not as an act of anger, but as a quiet acknowledgement that something precious had already been broken long before that afternoon. Then I sat at the dining room table and wrote a short handwritten note. It simply read, "I respected your decision. I truly hope the future you chose brings you everything you believe it will. Good luck, Michael." I folded the note neatly and placed it beside the house keys. There were no accusations, no insults, and no attempts to change her mind. By the time George and I reached his property on the edge of town, the sun was beginning to sink behind the trees. His small guest cottage overlooked a peaceful pond where ducks drifted quietly across the water. The calm surroundings felt strangely comforting after the emotional storm of the afternoon. As we carried the last box inside, my phone vibrated again. It was Emily. She had just spoken with her mother and sounded confused. "Dad, Mom says you agreed to move out. Is that true?" I took a slow breath before answering. I agreed not to argue. Those are two very different things. Emily remained silent for several seconds. "Something does not feel right," she whispered. I have never heard Mom sound like this before. I assured her that she did not need to choose sides and that I wanted her to continue loving both of us. After we ended the call, George poured 2 cups of coffee and we sat on the porch watching the evening sky darken. "You are taking this better than most people would," he observed. I smiled faintly. "There is no point fighting someone who has already made up their mind." George nodded thoughtfully before asking, "Then why do I have the feeling you know something the rest of us do not?" I looked toward the sunset and quietly answered, "Because Patricia celebrated the inheritance before she understood everything that came with it, and she never asked me the one question that could have changed today completely." At that exact moment, my phone began ringing again. This time the caller identification displayed Richard Collins, and something told me the evening was only beginning. Richard Collins did not waste time with small talk when I answered the phone. His voice sounded professional as always, but beneath that calm tone I detected genuine concern. "Michael, I have been trying to reach Patricia for the past hour," he said. "She has not returned my calls, and I believe there has been a serious misunderstanding." I leaned back in the wooden chair on George's porch while the evening breeze drifted across the pond. "What kind of misunderstanding?" I asked. Richard paused for a moment before choosing his words carefully. "Your wife became so excited after hearing the estimated value of the estate that she left before we completed the meeting. She signed the acknowledgement forms but declined my offer to review every document together. There are several conditions attached to the inheritance that require immediate attention." I remained silent. Richard continued, "One of those conditions directly affects both of you." I closed my eyes for a brief moment because I already suspected where the conversation was heading. Eleanor had always been a careful woman. She believed money should strengthen families rather than divide them. Several years earlier, she had quietly asked me whether Patricia handled financial pressure well. I remembered answering honestly that my wife had a generous heart, but sometimes made decisions before understanding every detail. At the time, the conversation seemed harmless. Now it carried new meaning. "Michael," Richard said, "I cannot discuss every legal detail over the telephone, but I need to ask one question. Did Patricia actually ask you to leave the marital home today?" "Yes," I answered. "She asked me to be gone before she returned this evening." Another long silence followed. Finally, Richard sighed. "I was afraid you would say that. Please do not make any decisions tonight. Simply stay where you are until I can arrange another meeting tomorrow morning." I thanked him without asking further questions. If the documents contained something important, I preferred hearing the explanation in person rather than guessing over the telephone. After we ended the call, George looked at me expectantly. "Well," he asked. I smiled faintly. "Apparently the paperwork is more complicated than Patricia realized." George laughed quietly. Sometimes people hear the number and stop listening. His observation stayed with me long after we finished our coffee. Around 8 that evening, my phone vibrated again. This time it was Emily. Her voice sounded anxious. "Dad, something strange is happening. Mom just called me asking if you had spoken with Mr. Collins." She sounded upset. I chose my words carefully because I refused to turn my daughter against her mother. Richard contacted me, but he only said there were legal details that still needed to be discussed. Emily hesitated before speaking again. Mom came home expecting everything to feel different, but instead she found your note, your wedding ring, and an empty house. I have never heard her sound so unsettled. I looked across the quiet water reflecting the first stars of the evening. Sometimes silence says more than arguments ever could, I replied. After ending the call, I unpacked only a few essentials in the guest cottage. One suitcase remained closed near the door because I still did not know how long I would stay. Before going to bed, I opened the small metal box that always traveled with me. Inside were copies of our marriage certificate, insurance records, retirement documents, and a handwritten letter Eleanor had mailed to me almost 2 years earlier after Patricia helped her recover from surgery. Eleanor thanked me for standing beside my wife through every season of life and ended the letter with a sentence I had never forgotten. Character always reveals itself when fortune arrives unexpectedly. I gently folded the letter and returned it to the box. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees while the night settled over the countryside. I had no desire to see Patricia embarrassed or defeated. Despite everything that had happened, 40 years of shared memories could not disappear in a single afternoon. But deep inside, I also understood that tomorrow's meeting with Richard Collins would reveal whether my marriage had ended because of millions of dollars or because the money had merely uncovered a truth that had been quietly waiting beneath the surface all along. The next morning, I arrived at Richard Collins's office 15 minutes early. Old habits stayed with me long after retirement. I had always believed that arriving on time showed respect, especially when important decisions needed to be made. Richard welcomed me into the same conference room where Patricia had celebrated her inheritance less than 24 hours earlier. A thick folder rested neatly on the polished wooden table beside 2 cups of coffee. His expression was serious but calm. "Thank you for coming, Michael," he said. "I wish yesterday had ended differently." I nodded quietly. "So do I." Before either of us could continue, the office door opened again. Patricia walked inside wearing an expensive new designer handbag I had never seen before. Her confident expression disappeared the moment she realized I was already there. She stopped for a second before taking the chair across from me. Neither of us spoke. Richard waited until we were both seated before opening the folder. "I asked both of you to come because there are provisions in Eleanor's estate that were never discussed yesterday," he began. Patricia left before I completed my explanation. Patricia folded her arms. "I already know the estate belongs to me." Richard looked directly at her. "The assets are indeed designated primarily for you. However, Eleanor included several legally binding conditions because she believed wealth should strengthen stable families rather than reward impulsive decisions." Patricia's expression slowly changed. Richard removed a document and slid it across the table. Section 7 states that if the beneficiary voluntarily abandons an existing marriage or intentionally forces a lawful spouse from the marital residence before the estate transfer is finalized, the estate immediately enters a mandatory review period. Patricia frowned as she scanned the page. "That only delays everything." Richard gently shook his head. "Not exactly. During that review, the independent trustees evaluate whether the beneficiary acted in good faith and honored Eleanor's stated family values. If they determine otherwise, they may suspend distributions, reduce discretionary assets, or redirect a substantial charitable portion according to Eleanor's written instructions." Silence filled the room. Patricia turned another page with noticeably slower movements. Richard continued. "Yesterday, before leaving my office, you signed a document confirming that you understood every condition attached to the inheritance. Unfortunately, you declined my recommendation to review the complete file." Patricia looked stunned. "I thought those were standard acknowledgement forms." Richard sighed quietly. "They were legal acknowledgments stating that you had received the opportunity to read every provision." She slowly lowered the papers onto the table. "So what happens now?" Richard answered honestly. "The trustees have already been notified because I became aware that Michael was instructed to leave the marital home on the very day you accepted the inheritance. Under Eleanor's instructions, I had a legal obligation to report any event that could affect the estate." Patricia looked toward me for the first time that morning. Her eyes searched my face as though expecting satisfaction or triumph. She found neither. I simply sat quietly with my hands folded together. After several uncomfortable moments, she finally asked, "Did you know about this?" I answered truthfully. I knew Eleanor believed money should never become more important than family. I did not know the exact wording of her estate. Richard reached for another document. There is one additional matter. Eleanor specifically wrote a personal letter explaining why she included these provisions. He carefully unfolded the handwritten pages and began reading aloud. Eleanor described how Michael had visited her every week after her health declined, repaired her home without accepting payment, managed emergency repairs during winter storms, and encouraged Patricia to spend more time with her aunt despite busy schedules. She ended the letter with one sentence that filled the room with complete silence. "If my niece ever values my money more than the loyal husband who quietly stood beside her through every difficult season, then she has misunderstood everything I hoped to leave behind." Patricia lowered her head. For the first time since that unforgettable phone call, the confidence that millions of dollars had given her completely disappeared, and I realized the hardest part of her inheritance had never been the legal conditions. It was facing the truth about the choice she had made before she ever finished reading the documents. Patricia left Richard Collins's office without saying another word. She carried the thick estate folder against her chest, as though holding it tightly might somehow change what was written inside. I watched the elevator doors close behind her before gathering my own documents. Richard quietly walked me to the reception area and stopped beside the front entrance. "Michael," he said, "I have practiced estate law for more than 30 years. I have seen families destroyed over much smaller inheritances. Whatever happens next, I hope both of you remember there is still time to make thoughtful decisions." I thanked him and stepped outside into the cool morning air. My life had changed dramatically in less than 48 hours, yet I felt surprisingly calm. There was no victory in what had happened. Watching someone you once loved discover the consequences of a painful choice was not satisfying. It was simply sad. I returned to George's guest cottage and spent the afternoon repairing a loose fence along the edge of his property. Physical work had always helped clear my thoughts. Hammer in hand, I focused on measuring boards, driving nails, and replacing weathered posts instead of replaying every conversation from the previous day. Around 4 o'clock, my phone rang again. This time it was Emily. Her voice sounded exhausted. "Dad, I stopped by the house after work. Mama's been calling banks, accountants, and Richard all day. She keeps saying there must be some mistake." I leaned against the freshly repaired fence and listened quietly. "How is she?" I asked. Emily hesitated before answering. "Honestly, I have never seen her like this. Yesterday she was talking about remodeling the kitchen, buying a vacation condominium, and taking a luxury cruise. Today she has not stopped reading legal documents." I understood exactly why. For the first time, Patricia was no longer looking at the inheritance through excitement. She was finally reading the responsibilities that came with it. Emily lowered her voice. "She asked if you had known about Aunt Eleanor's letter." "No," I answered truthfully. I knew Eleanor valued family, but I never knew exactly what she wrote. Emily sighed. "Mom keeps saying she should have listened until the meeting was over." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I said, "Sometimes the most expensive mistakes cost nothing at first. They only reveal their price later." That evening, George grilled hamburgers on the back patio while we watched the sun disappear behind the trees. He listened patiently as I explained everything Richard had shared. When I finished, George slowly nodded. "Sounds like Eleanor understood people better than most lawyers do." I smiled faintly. She always believed money magnified character instead of changing it. George pointed toward the repaired fence. "You spent 4 hours fixing something that belonged to me because you noticed it needed attention." That is exactly the kind of man she described in her letter. His words reminded me that my value had never depended on anyone's inheritance. The following morning, another unexpected call arrived. Richard informed me that the trustees had officially begun reviewing the estate and requested additional documentation regarding the events of the previous day. He explained that the process would likely take several weeks and that every statement from those directly involved would become part of the permanent record. Before ending the call, Richard added one final piece of information. Patricia asked whether there is any way to demonstrate good faith before the review concludes. I quietly asked what he had told her. Richard answered honestly, I explained that legal documents cannot rewrite personal decisions. Only future actions can demonstrate sincere intent. After hanging up, I stood quietly on the porch overlooking the peaceful pond. The morning breeze carried the sound of birds across the water, while everything around me felt remarkably ordinary. Yet I sensed that somewhere across town Patricia was beginning to understand a truth far greater than the value of the inheritance. Millions of dollars could purchase almost anything except trust once it had been carelessly thrown away. Just as I turned to go inside, another vehicle slowly pulled into George's driveway, and when I recognized the familiar blue sedan, I realized Patricia had finally decided to come looking for the one thing money could never replace. Patricia stepped out of the blue sedan much more slowly than I expected. Only 3 days earlier, she had sounded confident enough to end a 40-year marriage with a single telephone call. Now she stood at the edge of George's driveway holding the same estate folder, but the certainty that had filled her voice was gone. She looked tired, as though she had not slept since leaving Richard Collins's office. George quietly excused himself and walked toward his workshop, giving us the privacy we both needed. I opened the screen door and invited Patricia onto the porch. She looked around the small guest cottage before sitting carefully in one of the wooden chairs overlooking the pond. For several moments, neither of us spoke. The gentle sound of birds and moving water filled the silence. Finally, Patricia took a slow breath. "I made a terrible mistake," she said softly. I listened without interrupting. When Richard told me how much Aunt Eleanor had left, all I could think about was finally living without financial limits. I convinced myself that I deserved a completely different life. I never stopped long enough to consider what I was throwing away. Her honesty surprised me, but I remained quiet. She continued speaking. "After I came home and found your note, your wedding ring, and an empty house, I realized how cold I had become. Then Richard read Aunt Eleanor's letter, and everything started making sense." She looked down at her hands. "I spent 2 days reading every page of the estate documents. There were so many responsibilities, tax obligations, trustee approvals, maintenance requirements, and charitable commitments that I barely understood any of it. You always handled those things for us. I never appreciated how much work you quietly carried." I nodded gently. "I never minded doing those things because we were a team." Patricia closed her eyes for a moment. "That is exactly what I forgot." She looked directly at me for the first time since arriving. "Michael, I am not here because of the money. I know you probably do not believe that after everything I did, but I need to tell you the truth. Losing part of the inheritance frightened me for a few hours. Losing you frightened me much more." Her voice trembled, but she never looked away. I answered honestly. "Patricia, money did not end our marriage. Your decision did. The inheritance simply revealed how quickly you were willing to leave everything behind." Tears formed in her eyes. "Can you ever forgive me?" I took several seconds before responding because I wanted every word to be true. Forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. I can forgive someone while still remembering what happened. Trust takes much longer to rebuild. She quietly nodded because she understood the difference. After another long silence, she asked the question I had expected from the moment she arrived. "Would you come home?" I looked across the peaceful pond before answering. "Right now, I think both of us need time to understand who we became during the past few days. Going back immediately would not erase what happened." Patricia lowered her head, accepting my answer without argument. Before standing to leave, she carefully removed a small envelope from her purse and placed it on the table between us. "Richard suggested I write this instead of trying to explain everything at once," she said. "Read it whenever you are ready." She walked slowly back toward her car before turning one final time. "For 40 years you always put our family before yourself. I did not recognize that until I watched you leave without saying one cruel word. I am deeply sorry." I watched her drive away until the blue sedan disappeared beyond the trees. Only then did I pick up the envelope. Inside was not a request for reconciliation or another apology. Instead, I found copies of documents showing that Patricia had already contacted the trustees and voluntarily asked them to delay every estate distribution until she completed one important task she believed mattered more than receiving a single dollar. As I reached the final page, I realized her next decision might reveal whether the woman I married still existed beneath the painful choices she had made only days before. The envelope remained on the small kitchen table until the following morning. I wanted to read every page with a clear mind instead of allowing emotion to decide what I believed. After making coffee, I opened the documents again and carefully reviewed what Patricia had signed. Richard Collins had attached a short cover letter explaining that Patricia voluntarily requested the trustees postpone every distribution connected to Eleanor's estate until the family review process was complete. More importantly, she had submitted a written statement accepting full responsibility for asking me to leave our home before understanding either the legal conditions or the emotional consequences of her decision. She did not blame confusion, excitement, or anyone else's advice. She simply admitted that she had allowed money to become more important than the marriage we had spent 40 years building. That level of honesty surprised me. Later that afternoon, Richard called again. "Michael," he said, "the trustees received Patricia's statement this morning. They were not expecting such a direct acknowledgement." I quietly asked whether it would change anything. "It does not erase what happened," Richard answered, "but it demonstrates accountability." Eleanor believed people should be judged by what they chose after recognizing a mistake, not only by the mistake itself. Those words stayed with me long after the conversation ended. During the next 2 weeks, life settled into an unexpected routine. I continued helping George with projects around his property, while Patricia remained in the house alone. Emily visited both of us separately, refusing to pressure either parent toward a decision. Instead, she encouraged patience. One Saturday afternoon, she invited us to attend our grandson Noah's school music recital. I arrived early and quietly took a seat near the back of the auditorium. A few minutes later, Patricia entered through the opposite door. For a brief moment, our eyes met, but neither of us attempted an uncomfortable conversation. We simply smiled politely before focusing on Noah's performance. Watching our grandson proudly play his trumpet reminded me that families are rarely defined by one painful chapter. They continue growing through ordinary moments that quietly matter most. After the recital, Noah ran toward both of us without hesitation. He hugged Patricia first, and then wrapped his arms around me with the same excitement he always had. Children often see people more clearly than adults do. He did not know anything about inheritances, legal reviews, or broken trust. He only knew his grandparents had always loved him. As we stood together outside the school building, Patricia looked at me and gently asked, "Would you be willing to have dinner with Emily and Noah next Sunday?" No discussions about the estate. No pressure. Just family. I considered the invitation for several seconds before agreeing. "I can do that." Relief appeared across her face, although she wisely said nothing more. The following Sunday, we gathered at Emily's home. Conversation centered on Noah's baseball season, gardening, neighborhood events, and the pie Emily had baked that morning. Nobody mentioned lawyers or money. For the first time since that unforgettable telephone call, I caught small glimpses of the woman I had married decades earlier. Patricia laughed when Noah proudly described catching his first fly ball and offered to help Emily wash dishes without being asked. Nothing extraordinary happened, yet everything felt different because kindness had quietly replaced pride. As the afternoon came to an end, Emily walked beside me to my truck. "Dad," she said softly, "I know trust cannot return overnight, but today felt like the beginning of something healthier." I nodded thoughtfully. Healing usually begins with ordinary moments, not dramatic speeches. As I drove back toward George's cottage, I realized that the inheritance review was no longer the most important question facing our family. The real question was whether two people who had nearly thrown away 40 years together could build something honest from the painful truth they had finally learned. The answer would not come from lawyers, trustees, or financial documents. It would come from the choices Patricia and I continued making one quiet day at a time. 3 weeks after Patricia asked the trustees to postpone the inheritance process, Richard Collins invited both of us back to his office. This meeting felt very different from the first one. There was no excitement, no celebration, and no confidence built on the promise of unexpected wealth. Patricia arrived carrying only a notebook instead of expensive shopping catalogs or renovation plans. I noticed that she had returned the designer handbag she purchased during those first emotional hours. It was a small detail, but it reflected a much larger change in perspective. Richard welcomed us into the conference room and smiled warmly. "The trustees have completed their review," he said. "Before I explain their decision, I want both of you to know they carefully considered every document, every statement, and every action that followed the original incident. Patricia quietly nodded while keeping her eyes on the table. Richard opened the final report. The trustees determined that the initial decision to remove Michael from the marital home directly conflicted with Eleanor's wishes regarding family unity. However, they also recognized Patricia's immediate acceptance of responsibility, her request to delay the inheritance voluntarily, and her consistent efforts to repair the damage without attempting to manipulate the review process. He paused before continuing. As a result, the charitable provisions remain exactly as Eleanor intended, and the estate will now proceed without additional financial penalties. Patricia slowly closed her eyes as though a tremendous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Surprisingly, she did not smile. Instead, she quietly thanked Richard before asking for a copy of Eleanor's letter once more. "I want to keep reading it," she explained. "I never want to forget how easily I almost lost everything that truly mattered." After leaving the office, Patricia asked if we could stop by the small public park where we had often walked together after dinner during the early years of our marriage. The autumn leaves covered the walking paths, and children laughed while feeding ducks near the pond. We found an empty bench overlooking the water. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Patricia looked toward the quiet lake and said, "When I believed I had become wealthy, I thought my future had finally begun. I never realized my best life had already been beside me for 40 years. I listened without interrupting. "Do you remember the old station wagon that broke down during our vacation in Tennessee?" she asked with a faint smile. I laughed softly. "I remember sleeping in the car while waiting for the repair shop to open." She nodded. "At the time, I thought it was one of the worst weekends of my life. Now it is one of my favorite memories because we faced it together." She turned toward me with tears quietly filling her eyes. Somewhere along the way, I stopped measuring my life by moments like that and started measuring it by things I did not have. I gently answered, "That happens more easily than people realize." She reached into her notebook and removed one folded sheet of paper. "This is not another apology," she said. "It is a list." Curious, I unfolded the page. She had written 40 memories, one for every year of our marriage. Each memory described a moment that had nothing to do with money. Emily taking her first steps, camping trips, Christmas mornings, building our first porch together, caring for her parents during their final years, watching Noah born. At the bottom, she had written one final sentence. "Not one of the happiest days of my life required millions of dollars." I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket. As we walked back toward our separate cars, Patricia did not ask me to return home. She simply smiled gently and said, "Whether we rebuild our marriage or only rebuild our friendship, I want every decision from this day forward to be based on gratitude instead of greed." I watched her drive away beneath the golden autumn trees, realizing that the greatest inheritance Eleanor had truly left behind was never the money waiting in legal documents. It was the painful but priceless lesson that revealed what our family had almost forgotten, and I knew the final decision about our future still belonged to both of us. Several months passed before I realized that healing rarely arrives all at once. It comes quietly through ordinary mornings, familiar conversations, and small choices repeated again and again. I continued living in George's guest cottage while Patricia remained in our house. Neither of us rushed toward a decision because we both understood that rebuilding trust required patience instead of promises. Every Sunday, we met with Emily, Noah, and the rest of the family for dinner. Slowly, the awkward silences became comfortable conversations. We laughed again. We shared stories again. We remembered the people we had been before one unexpected inheritance tested everything we believed about ourselves. One crisp December afternoon, Patricia called and asked whether I would meet her at the house. When I arrived, I noticed something immediately. The front porch railing I had planned to replace before everything happened had finally been repaired. Patricia smiled gently when she saw me looking at it. "I watched enough videos to learn how to do it myself," she admitted with a quiet laugh. "It took me 3 weekends, and it is probably not as good as yours would have been." I examined the work carefully before smiling. "It is sturdy. That is what matters." She looked at me with grateful eyes. "I finally understand something I never appreciated before. Every repair you made around this house, every bill you paid on time, every winter storm you prepared for, every difficult decision you quietly handled, they were all expressions of love. I only noticed them after they were gone. We walked slowly through the familiar rooms where 40 years of memories still lived. Nothing felt exactly the same, yet nothing felt hopeless either. Before I left, Patricia handed me a small wooden box. Inside rested my wedding ring exactly as I had left it weeks earlier. She did not ask me to wear it. She simply said, "Whether you ever choose this again is entirely your decision. I wanted you to have it because it belongs to your story as much as mine." I closed the box and placed it carefully into my coat pocket. During the following months, we continued rebuilding our relationship one conversation at a time. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no grand celebration, and no magical moment that erased the past. Instead, there was honesty, accountability, and consistent effort. Those things proved far more valuable than dramatic apologies. Richard Collins eventually informed us that Eleanor's estate had been fully distributed according to her wishes. Patricia honored every charitable commitment her aunt had written into the trust, and together we established a small scholarship in Eleanor's memory for students pursuing careers in skilled trades, because she always admired people who built things with their hands. Looking back now, I realized the inheritance was never the true gift. The real gift was the painful lesson that forced both of us to confront what mattered most before it was too late. Money can make life more comfortable, but it cannot replace loyalty, kindness, or decades of shared memories. Those are treasures no legal document can create and no bank account can guarantee. Sometimes people ask me what I said when Patricia finally came home after everything had happened. I always smile because the answer has never changed. I wished her good luck, not because I wanted her to fail, but because I hoped she would discover the same truth I eventually learned. Luck may bring money into your life, but only character determines whether the people you love choose to stay. In the end, our future was not saved by millions of dollars. It was saved by humility, forgiveness, and the courage to become better than the worst decision either of us had ever made.